Alright, so after you've created your document, you've saved your document, some people decide that the standard 550 by 400 pixel dimension sucks and you don't like it. It's more of that 3 to 4 ugly shape, and people want more of the cool widescreen proportion. So to figure out what the widescreen proportion is, we can simply do the math of going for the widescreen 16 by 9 ratio. So if I take 16 by 9, so divide 16 by 9, that gives me a magic number of 1.7 something or another. It's about 1.72 is what it rounds out to be. And if I want to work with the same stage height that I have here, that means to get a 16 by 9 proportion out of my flash file, I need to modify the properties of my document. So I can go under the Properties panel, click Edit, and choose the size of 711 pixels by 400 gives me approximately a 6 by 9 proportion to my flash file. So if I want that cool widescreen shape, then that would be something that I would choose. If I want to change the background color because I just really do not like that white as my background color because I find it's distracting, it's just too bright and burns my eyes, I can now change that as well. So that's a one-stop shop for updating my document properties. So now I've added in a new size, I've changed the color of it, and I think that's just a little more elegant, a little more pleasing shape when I'm trying to create an animation or more of a movie type of project. So now moving into the next step, now that the document's been set up, what I can do is start to add in some things, the non-moving elements that are going to go into my project. So non-moving elements might be something like my sky. So I'm going to choose a nice, pretty sky color, and I am going to undo that because that's not the color I want. Now also notice as I'm drawing with the rectangle, I don't want a stroke on it, so I will click in the stroke section and choose the box with the red line through it. That indicates no stroke. I just want a fill color, and I need to switch from the oval tool to the rectangle. And now I can draw a blue shape for my sky. Now I'm going to name that layer that I've put the sky on. I'll just call it sky. And after you've completed working on a layer, it's a really good idea to take that layer and click the lock in the lock column, because that will prevent you from accidentally adding artwork to that layer when you didn't intend to do so. And I will demonstrate why by doing it wrong. That layer is unlocked. I add a new layer. This will be the ground that I'm going to add to my project. But if I accidentally at some point click on this bottom ground layer, grab my rectangle tool, choose a new color, and let's try again. Click off it so nothing's selected. Now grab my rectangle. Now if I draw a rectangle here, and I need to have it different, but as we can see, because I drew it on the same layer, it will cut out the artwork that's there. So if I go here, click off, move, it's cutting holes. So that's really not a very happy place to be. So I want to lock my sky layer, go to my next layer. As long as I'm there, I will double click on it, rename it. I'll call it ground. And at this point, when I grab the rectangle tool, it's very straightforward to draw a shape. Now I have the ground. Now you may notice at this point that I've run into a little bit of a problem, and that is I can't tell where the edges of my stage are. So we need to come up with a system, a way to deal with that. Now it would be nice if I could say work like I do in other programs, pull up the guides and set up guides and work with guides. But what happens is the artwork sits on top of the guides in Flash. It doesn't work really well, and then when you go back and forth between assets, it becomes problematic. So there's a better solution that people have figured out to do. So I'm going to now lock my ground layer, add in a new layer, and this is going to be my stage guide. Now the stage guide layer, I am going to add a rectangle to it, and I'm going to give the rectangle a stroke, but this time the rectangle will have no fill. So I just have my stroke, no fill selected, and then I just draw a box, just like that, plain and simple. Now you may notice that this box is not the size of my movie. and I don't care. Well, I do care, but I'm not concerned, I'm not worried about it at this point because I can update it, I can change it by switching to the select tool, double clicking on it so it highlights the whole box. We can see how it makes the line fat and puts the little hash pattern on it. So if I double click on the box, it selects it, and once that box is selected, I can go into its properties and modify its X, set that to 0, tab to the next field, set its Y to 0, and then tab to the next field, its width, which is 711, and its height of 400. And now that will show me exactly where the boundaries of my stage are, so then when I start animating, I can keep track of this. So that's a really handy technique. Now to take this layer and prevent me from making any unintended changes to it, I can just take that layer and simply lock it. Now I can't select anything on it, I can't draw on it, it is now locked. So now I'm in a good position. So now that I have my stage guide drawn on here, if I test my movie, and I test movie by going under Control, Test Movie, Test, that's way too many clicks to get to. It's much easier just to remember it's Command Enter or Command Return on the keyboard, and then that pulls it up. And now if we look at my movie, we can see that it does have this real faint red line around the edges. If I stretch this out, we can see, so that red line is publishing. Generally, I'm probably not going to want that red line to show up in my finished artwork. So what I can do is take this layer and change it from a normal layer to a guide layer. And I do that by right-clicking on the layer or double-clicking on the page icon, not the name, but the page icon for the layer. And from there, I can then select Guide. And when I do so, it changes the icon in the Layers palette to a little T-square. And when I publish my movie, we can see that that doesn't show. So on guide layers, it's not uncommon. On a guide layer, I'll unlock this really quick, but on a guide layer, it's not uncommon for people to put a bunch of text or notes to themselves. So they'll put this text in it, but because it's on a guide layer, even if I turn off the layer, so I go, oh look, these layers are turned off. When I publish my movie, Flash will show you any layers that are not guided. It will show it to you. It doesn't care if you turn it off. In Photoshop, Illustrator, and Design, you turn off layers, and when you create a published file, those layers don't publish with it. But in Flash, layers that are turned off still will publish. So when I publish this, you'll see that, see, the green and blue showed up even though they're turned off. But notice that the text I wrote and my guide are missing, where if this is not a guide layer, and if I publish my movie, we will see the text and the red box are there. So the important concept, the takeaway on this is that when a layer is a guide layer, then that means whatever you put on that layer will not show in the final artwork. So you can put color swatches, you can put detailed text notes. If you download template files, whether it's animation artwork or a whole Flash website artwork, and you go buy or acquire these template files, they often will have a guide layer filled with lots and lots of notes right in the file telling you what to modify, how to make changes so that you can update that project appropriately. So I'm using a tablet, but whether you use a tablet or just work with a brush doesn't really matter. So I have this layer, all my other layers are locked, so if we look in the layers palette we can see the layers are locked, and technically I will refer to this as the layers palette when I'm working on layers, and the timeline when I work across here, but the whole thing, layers and timeline, is it's just called the timeline, or it's the timeline window. That's the proper name for it in Flash, but it's a layers window in every other application, so I refer to it as layers. I have a timeline here, so depending on whether I'm on the layers themselves or moving across time, it will change how I refer to it. So I just want to provide a little clarity, because if you go up here and look for a layers palette under window, you won't see it because your layers are part of the timeline. So just want to point out that small subtle thing. So I'm going to work with the brush. Now one thing that you may find when you work with a brush in Flash is that the size of the brush is dependent on where you are zoomed. So if I am zoomed right here at 100%, if I make some lines, so we can see how wide that is. Now if I zoom out, if you notice, that mark it's making on screen is exactly the same size on my monitor as it was when I was at 100%, but you can see it's bigger in the document. Now if I zoom way in, it's still making that same mark. So if I were to put my finger up to my screen, it's the same size mark on my monitor. So unlike in, say, Photoshop, where you make your brush bigger and smaller, in Flash, your brush gets bigger or smaller based on your zoom level. So if I want to make something that is really detailed, I can zoom way in and then draw, because then when I return to 100%, we can see that that becomes a much smaller line. If I want to fill the stage very quickly, then I would zoom way out. So then I can fill the stage very, very quickly. So the mark is always going to be the same physical size on my monitor, but the size as it relates to my document changes based on whether I zoom in or zoom out. It's a different way of working than other programs that at first I thought was really dumb, and it grew on me, and now I find that I prefer it, and I find it gives me a little nicer control over the brush than always having to just make my brush bigger and smaller. I find that this works much easier, because now if I want to fill my document quickly, boy, that really worked quick. Now I am going to zoom way out because I'm going to make a piece of artwork for my mountains that's much bigger than my whole stage. Not zoom out that far. And as I'm zooming in and out, I'm using Command plus and Command minus, the same key commands we use in pretty much all of the different programs that we're going to use. So I'm drawing some very detailed, exacting mountains here. Now if I've made the top edge of the mountains, I can't just grab the paint bucket and try and fill it, because the paint bucket wants to try and fill a continuous shape. So I need to draw a little bit more on my mountains and extend them down a little bit. So now that I've done that and created a solid continuous shape, I can, with my paint bucket, I can now choose a different color, and I can fill in my mountain shape. So now the mountains have been filled with my color. Now you may find that sometimes your paint bucket doesn't work as well as you would like, and you can modify it, because its default is don't close gaps. That means unless it is a true, completely, utterly closed area you're trying to fill, it won't do it. If there's any break in the line that you're trying to fill, it won't fill it. You can choose close large gaps where it's less picky about the whole situation, or medium or small, depending on your artwork. If you're very exacting when you draw, it will always be closed, but most of us find that we're not able to close every gap all the time. We'll miss a spot here or there, and that's where you can modify the tolerance of the paint bucket to close gaps. So that's a nice to know thing. All right, so now that I've created some mountains here, I'm going to name that layer Mountains. And the final thing I want to do with my mountains is I want to select both the stroke and the fill on my mountains, and I'm going to convert them to a symbol, because once they're converted to a symbol, I will then be able to animate them. So I could use the marquee tool or lasso tool to select them, or I've selected the fill. If I hold down shift, I can click on the stroke or the outline on my mountain, so everything is highlighted with the hash pattern. Hit F8 on the keyboard and then convert this to a symbol. And once it's a symbol, then I can start animating.